The documents were in a cream envelope with a pale blue ribbon. Tasteful. Expensive-looking. The kind of envelope you'd expect to find a heartfelt letter inside, or maybe a handwritten poem someone had labored over for weeks. My mother held it out to me like a gift, her smile perfectly calibrated, warm enough to seem genuine, controlled enough to hide what was underneath. My name is Paige. I was 32 years old, standing at the edge of a ballroom wearing heels that were beginning to hurt, watching my sister Madison become Mrs. Tyler Caldwell in front of 127 people who had no idea what was about to happen. I was a licensed interior designer. I had a small studio with 3 employees and a waiting list I'd built from nothing. I had an apartment in the South End that smelled like coffee and drafting pencils, and I had a grandmother named Eleanor who had loved me quietly and consistently for my entire life. That was what I had going into that evening. What I didn't have was any idea that everything was about to collapse into the open. The ceremony had already ended. Madison was radiant in ivory lace, Tyler was grinning at the head table, and the champagne was moving through the room in smooth golden circles. I was still holding my bouquet when my mother appeared at my elbow, unhurried, her voice low and private. "Paige. We need a moment." She steered me toward a side alcove near the terrace doors, where my father Richard stood looking at the floor, hands folded in front of him. He had that particular stillness that I'd come to recognize over the years, not calm, exactly, but a careful absence of expression, like a man who had already decided something and was waiting for it to be over. The envelope appeared. "This is for Madison and Tyler," my mother said. "As a wedding gift. From the family." I looked at the ribbon. I looked at my father. Something moved through me, not alarm, not yet, more like the faint pressure you feel when a room is too warm and you can't immediately identify why. "What is it?" I asked. "The penthouse," she said. "Your grandmother left it to you in the will, but that was never." She paused. A carefully placed pause. The kind that communicates that what comes next is obvious, and that my failure to already understand is the problem. That was never meant to be permanent. Eleanor was not herself when she made those decisions. We all know that. It was always supposed to stay in the family, for Madison's future, for the Caldwells, for. She was perfectly herself, I said quietly. My mother looked at me for exactly 3 seconds. Then she smiled again. "Just open the envelope, Paige." Inside were transfer documents. Clean, professional, already prepared. My signature was needed on 4 pages. I had not known, standing there with the ribbon still in my fingers, that Marcus Webb, my grandmother's attorney of 23 years, was already in that ballroom. I had not known that Eleanor herself had been quietly informed 2 days earlier about what Victoria intended to do at the wedding. I had not known that what I was holding in my hands was not just a request, but the final move in a plan that had been running for nearly 3 years. I placed the envelope back in my mother's hand. Her expression shifted. Just slightly. Just enough. That was the moment the evening stopped being a wedding. Looking back now, I understand that the envelope wasn't the beginning. It was the end of a long, patient construction, the final pressure point in something my mother had been building since the moment my grandmother's will was read in a lawyer's office on a gray November afternoon in 2021. But you don't see architecture when you're standing inside it. You just feel the walls getting closer. The will reading had taken place on a Tuesday. I remember that specifically because I'd canceled a client consultation that morning and felt vaguely guilty about it, the way you feel guilty about small professional disruptions when you're trying to appear more put together than you are. I had taken the train to Marcus Webb's office in Beacon Hill, and Eleanor had been there in her good coat, very upright, very present, with her reading glasses on a chain around her neck. Marcus had read the documents in his measured, precise way. The penthouse on Commonwealth Avenue, 4 bedrooms, original crown molding, a view that stopped people mid-sentence, was bequeathed to me. Paige Harrison. Full ownership. I remember the silence afterward. Not the brief silence of surprise, but the longer, denser silence of several people making calculations they were not ready to express out loud. My mother left the office without speaking to me. In the weeks that followed, I told myself it was grief. Eleanor was still alive, but she was 81, and the will reading had made that fact suddenly concrete in a way that normal life managed to obscure. Victoria Harrison had complicated feelings about her own mother, I knew that, had always known it in the half-conscious way you know things about your family that no one has ever directly explained. I told myself she would adjust. The first time she brought up the penthouse, it was framed as a question. We were having lunch at the restaurant she preferred, the one with white tablecloths and servers who knew her by name. She asked whether I had thought about what I was going to do with such a large space, given that I was single, given that my studio was in the South End, given that managing a property like that required resources and attention. It seemed practical to think about it, she said. I agreed that it was practical. I said I hadn't made any decisions yet. I ate my salad. She mentioned Madison. How Madison and Tyler were looking at apartments in the Back Bay. How the Caldwells were a family of standing, how this marriage was an opportunity for the Harrisons to build something lasting. How Eleanor had always wanted the family to be together. Eleanor wanted me to have it, I said. My mother looked at me with an expression I had seen my entire life, a particular blend of patience and disappointment, as if I had said something technically accurate but fundamentally missing the point. Eleanor wasn't well when she made those decisions, she said. I put my fork down. She was perfectly fine. Paige. A pause. You know how much she adored you. That's not in question. But she was confused about certain things toward the end. Marcus will tell you the same. Marcus, I would later discover, would tell me no such thing. But in that moment, sitting across from my mother in a restaurant she had selected, wearing clothes she had commented on approvingly for the first time in months, I felt something I am not proud of, doubt. Not about Eleanor, about myself. About whether my perception of events was reliable. About whether I was the kind of person who would take advantage of an elderly woman's affection and call it love. That was the first red flag I ignored. Not what she said about Eleanor, but what she said about me without saying it. The implication that my version of reality required her validation before it counted. I felt it as discomfort. I didn't yet recognize it as a technique. That autumn was quiet in the way that things are quiet when a lot is being suppressed. I focused on work. I had a residential project in Cambridge, a townhouse renovation for a couple relocating from London, and I poured myself into it with the particular intensity I'd always reserved for periods when my personal life felt unsteady. The drafting table at 2 in the morning. The fabric samples spread across the studio floor. The clean logic of spatial problems, which had answers you could measure. My friend Daniel called every few weeks. He was a journalist, investigative, freelance, the kind of person who noticed patterns in public records the way I noticed proportional imbalances in a room. We'd been friends since graduate school. He asked about the penthouse situation and I gave him the abbreviated version, the one where everything was uncomfortable but manageable. Victoria's been talking, he said on one of those calls. About what? About you. About Eleanor. People in your mother's circle. I asked him what she was saying. He told me she'd described Eleanor as having cognitive decline. Had mentioned, to at least 2 people he knew of, that I'd been positioning myself for years to inherit from her. That I had, his pause was careful, taken advantage of a vulnerable woman's loneliness. I sat with that information for a long time after we hung up. I hadn't been positioning myself. I had been present. I had driven Eleanor to her appointments when my parents were traveling, had eaten dinner with her on Thursday evenings for years, had listened to her stories about the Cape Cod house where she'd summered as a young woman, the smell of low tide and wild roses, the particular quality of late afternoon light over the water. I had been present because I loved her. Because she was one of the few people in my life who saw me clearly and without agenda. But I noticed, in the weeks after Daniel's call, that some of my parents' friends had begun to look at me differently at family gatherings. A certain hesitation. A warmth that had gone slightly careful. I said nothing. I thought staying quiet would de-escalate things. That was the second thing I got wrong. Madison announced her engagement in January. Tyler Caldwell was 34, an attorney at a white shoe firm, well-connected, precisely the kind of man our mother had been mentally auditioning for years. The announcement was made at a family dinner I had driven 40 minutes to attend, and within 20 minutes of the toast, my mother had mentioned the penthouse twice. Not directly. She had a way of not directly doing things that was its own form of fluency. We'll want something beautiful for the reception, obviously, somewhere with space and history, and, a glance around the table, a small laugh, well, we do have options. Madison smiled at me from across the table. It was a complicated smile. My sister and I had never been close in the way some sisters are. We were 8 years apart, had grown up in parallel rather than together, and somewhere in the middle of my adolescence my mother had begun directing her primary attention toward Madison in a way that I had eventually stopped trying to understand and simply accepted. But that smile that evening contained something beyond our usual careful neutrality. It contained expectation. Obviously the penthouse wouldn't be used for a reception, I said, keeping my voice light. Eleanor still considers it her primary residence. A brief silence. Eleanor hasn't been there in 8 months, my mother said. That was true. Eleanor had been staying at her house in the suburbs for health reasons, easier access, less stairs, a garden she loved. But the penthouse was still hers in the way places are yours when you have chosen them deliberately, when every room contains decades of considered living. After dinner, my father found me in the kitchen. He was carrying his glass of wine and he stood for a moment looking at the window above the sink, which was dark and reflective. Your mother has a lot riding on this, he said finally. She always does. Paige. He turned. It would mean a great deal. To Madison. To the family. The penthouse belongs to me, Dad. He nodded slowly, as if I'd said something he was agreeing with on a technicality. Of course. He walked back to the dining room. I stood in the kitchen for a moment. I had not been building a real relationship with my father, I understood then. I had been maintaining the appearance of one, and telling myself that was the same thing. The realization landed quietly, the way realizations do when they've actually been there for a long time. Spring arrived and the pressure became less subtle. I began to receive calls from relatives I hadn't spoken to in years, an aunt in Connecticut, a second cousin who'd been distant since a family disagreement years earlier. They all framed it differently, but the core message was the same: Madison was starting her life, the penthouse was just sitting empty, family should support family. I wondered who had organized this. I did not wonder very long. Then Daniel called again. He had been looking into something, not for an article, he was careful to say, just because he'd noticed something while going through public property records for an unrelated story. The Cape Cod house. The one Eleanor had spoken about with such particular tenderness, the house where she'd spent 40 summers, where my grandfather had built a screened porch with his own hands. It had been sold 18 months earlier. For $875,000. I sat down slowly at my drafting table. Eleanor didn't know, Daniel said. It wasn't a question. She would have told me. The signature on the transfer documents, he paused. I'm not saying anything definitive. But it's worth having someone look at it. Eleanor was at her home in Newton when I drove out that Thursday evening. She was in her garden, which had come into its spring fullness, irises she'd planted 20 years ago, a rose bed she tended with particular discipline. She looked up when she saw me, and her expression shifted the way it always did, into a particular kind of welcome that I had never seen directed at anyone else in quite the same way. I sat down next to her on the garden bench. I told her what Daniel had found. The silence was very long. I didn't sell it, she said. Her voice was steady. I never signed anything. She looked at her hands in her lap. I was in the hospital that autumn. Pneumonia. I was there for 16 days. I stayed with her for 3 hours that evening. When I drove back to the city, I called Marcus Webb. Marcus had been Eleanor's attorney for 23 years. He was 70, precise, and had a particular quality of stillness that I associated with people who had spent decades holding other people's secrets without being diminished by them. When I called him that night, he listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "I've been waiting for this call." He told me he had questions of his own about the Cape Cod transfer, that he had not been involved in the transaction, that Eleanor had not consulted him, which was unusual. He had assumed, at the time, that she'd made a private decision for private reasons. He had not pushed. "I should have pushed," he said quietly. "We hired a forensic document specialist through a firm Marcus knew, Forensic Document Services, based in Boston. They were given copies of the Cape Cod transfer, the signature pages, and samples of Eleanor's genuine signature from documents Marcus had on file. The analysis took 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks I continued to work. I met with clients. I reviewed tile samples and fabric swatches. I had a difficult conversation with one of my employees about a project timeline and handled it with more patience than I felt. I did not tell anyone except Daniel what was happening. The instinct towards secrecy was not strategic at first. It was protective. I had learned, over the previous 18 months, that information I shared with my family had a way of traveling in directions I hadn't intended, arriving at destinations I hadn't chosen. My mother's social network was vast and efficient, and she had been making use of it. I had understood, by that spring, that I was already operating at an information deficit, that she knew things about my position, my allies, my uncertainty, that I had not told her. So, I said nothing. And I waited. The forensic report arrived on a Thursday. Marcus called me as I was leaving a client presentation. The probability of forgery, 98.7%. Hospital records confirmed Eleanor had been admitted for pneumonia on the exact date the document bore her signature. She had been on 4 antibiotics for the first 5 days. She had not left the facility. I sat in my car in a parking garage for a long time. I had spent 18 months telling myself it might not be as bad as it seemed. That there was probably an explanation. That my mother, for all her faults, the favoritism, the social maneuvering, the quiet cruelty of her particular brand of emotional management, would not have crossed into something legally irreversible. That the woman who had raised me, however imperfectly, had not committed fraud. Denial isn't weakness, I understood then. It's a decision. You choose it because the alternative costs more than you're ready to pay. And you keep choosing it until the cost of the truth is finally less than the weight of carrying the lie. The alternative now had receipts. Marcus and I met twice in the weeks before Madison's wedding. Eleanor was present at both meetings. She was composed and precise and angrier than I had ever seen her, not loudly angry, but with the contained fury of a woman who had been patient for 81 years and had recently discovered the limits of her patience. She had already spoken to Marcus about what she wanted to happen at the wedding. She had made specific plans. She will try at the wedding, Eleanor said. She has been building toward it. The guests, the social pressure, the family present, it is exactly the environment she prefers. She was right. She had always understood Victoria better than I had. Probably because she had raised her and had spent longer watching the architecture of her. Marcus told me what to do when the moment came. He told me where he would be positioned in the room, and who else would be there. He told me that when my mother presented the documents, I should decline calmly, collect my things, and call his number. "Don't argue," he said. "Don't explain. Just leave." "She'll escalate," I said. "Yes," he agreed. "She will." Daniel had by then written a complete account of the Cape Cod sale, the property records, the timeline, the hospital records, the discrepancy in the signatures. It was not yet published. It was sitting in a secure folder, ready. I drove to the wedding with a feeling I didn't immediately have a name for. Not dread, exactly. Not calm. Something between the two, a stillness that comes when you have already made all the decisions there are to make, and now you are simply moving toward the outcome. The ballroom of the Langham Hotel had been dressed with white peonies and eucalyptus, and the light was golden and late and very beautiful. 127 guests. 3 circuit court judges among them, which I had not known until Marcus mentioned it quietly when I arrived. Several attorneys. 2 partners from Tyler's firm. The Caldwell family in a full, prosperous phalanx near the front. My parents at the head table with the careful social performance they had always been very good at. Madison was genuinely radiant. I want to say that clearly because it is true and because she was my sister and because whatever was coming was not her wedding day's fault. She glowed with the particular happiness of someone whose life is moving exactly as she had been told it would, and I felt something for her in that moment that was complicated and real. Then my mother found me near the terrace doors. The envelope. The ribbon. The documents. Just open it, Paige. I placed it back in her hand. My father looked at the floor. This is not a request, my mother said. Her voice had dropped. Around us, the nearest tables were engaged in their own conversations, but I could feel the attention of the room beginning to orient toward us the way attention does when something shifts in a social environment. This has gone on long enough. This stubbornness, this performance of yours, it has cost this family. I'm not signing anything, I said. What happened next moved quickly. My mother's voice rose. Not loudly, she was too controlled for that, but enough. A few nearby conversations stalled. Heads turned. And once heads turned, others turned to see what the first ones were looking at, and within 60 seconds the golden warmth of that ballroom had developed a crack running straight through its center. She said I had manipulated an old woman. She said I had cultivated Eleanor's affection deliberately and strategically. She said I had been poisoning the family's relationships for years with my jealousy, my selfishness, my inability to simply be part of something larger than myself. She said Eleanor was not competent. Had not been competent for years. Said Marcus Webb had enabled a senile woman's fantasies because it served his billable hours. The room was very quiet. Marcus Webb stood up from a table near the window. He was unhurried. He straightened his jacket, picked up a leather document folder, and walked to the center of the room with the calm of a man who had been waiting for precisely this moment and had prepared for it thoroughly. He introduced himself to the room, though many people already knew him, and he said, in his measured voice, that he had some documents he would like to share with the assembled guests. Eleanor was escorted in from a side entrance by a member of the hotel staff. She was in her good coat, her reading glasses on their chain. She looked, if anything, more composed than anyone else in the room. Marcus presented the forensic report. He described the findings. He noted the hospital records. He noted the timeline. He presented Eleanor's own signed statement confirming she had not authorized the Cape Cod sale and had not been consulted. He then presented Eleanor's original will, witnessed and notarized, leaving the penthouse on Commonwealth Avenue to me, along with a supplementary document Eleanor had signed 10 days earlier, in front of 2 witnesses, reaffirming her full cognitive competence as assessed by 2 independent physicians. My mother stood very still. Victoria, Eleanor said, from where she had settled into a chair Marcus had placed for her. Her voice carried in the silence. I have been patient with you for a very long time. The 3 circuit court judges were paying close attention. I felt the moment when my mother understood that the room was no longer hers. It moved through her face in a single unguarded second, shock, then fury, then the particular blankness of someone recalculating in real time. She turned to me. And then she slapped me. It was not hard. It was not meant to hurt physically. It was the gesture of someone who has run out of all other moves and reaches for the one that still feels like control. It made a small sound in the quiet ballroom, and my earring came loose and fell to the floor, and I reached down and picked it up. I straightened. I looked at her. I said nothing. I walked to the exit. I called Marcus's number as I pushed through the door. Behind me, I heard my father's voice saying my mother's name. I heard someone at the Caldwell table say something in a low, urgent tone. I heard, very faintly, the sound of Madison beginning to cry. I kept walking. Even now, thinking back to that moment, the feeling of the hotel carpet under my heels, the cold air of the lobby, my hand holding the phone, there is something that stirs in me. Not triumph. Not even relief. Something quieter. The feeling of having finally, after a long time, stopped pretending. The gap between what I had believed was possible in my family and what had actually been true was not something I could unsee anymore. But I had stopped carrying it alone, and that changed the weight of it entirely. The legal proceedings were not quick. They rarely are. The Cape Cod forgery became a formal fraud case, filed through Marcus in the weeks following the wedding. The forensic report was entered as evidence. Eleanor gave a deposition that lasted 4 hours, during which she was, by all accounts, methodical and devastating. My mother retained her own attorney. She did not apologize. My father called me 3 weeks after the wedding. He was subdued in a way I hadn't heard from him before, not the careful absence of expression I was used to, but something genuinely reduced. He said he hadn't known about the forgery. I chose to believe him, not because I was certain it was true, but because the alternative, that he had known and signed documents anyway, standing at the edge of what he knew, was more than I could carry alongside everything else. That was a boundary I drew for my own preservation, not his. I should have asked more questions, he said. Yes, I said. You should have. We didn't speak for another 2 months after that. When we did, it was carefully, and within limits we had both implicitly agreed to without discussing. Madison reached out in the autumn. Her message was long and difficult to read. She acknowledged things I hadn't expected her to acknowledge. She said she had felt pressured. She said she had told herself that what our mother was doing was normal family management, that the penthouse was a complicated situation, that I was being rigid. She said she understood, now, that she had made herself convenient. I appreciated the honesty. I was not yet ready to trust it. Those are 2 different things, and I had recently learned to treat them as separate. The penthouse was formally transferred into my name that December, after a court process Marcus navigated with the same unhurried precision he brought to everything. I visited it for the first time as its legal owner on a Sunday morning in early winter, when the light through the tall windows was flat and white and the Commonwealth Avenue elms had dropped their leaves. I walked through the rooms slowly. The crown molding. The original fireplaces. The kitchen Eleanor had renovated in the 90s with the particular confidence of someone who knew exactly what she wanted. I sat on the floor of the main room for a while. I did not think anything very organized. I thought about Eleanor, who was well and sharp and had recently begun a new reading project she was enthusiastic about. I thought about the texture of the past 3 years, the slow accumulation of pressure, the instinct towards silence, the moments I had chosen doubt over clarity. I thought about how long I had spent being good at the wrong things. At keeping the peace. At not asking. At making everything look fine from the outside. I had spent years building a studio from nothing. Earning clients by delivering on what I promised. Creating spaces that worked, that had integrity in their structure, that didn't pretend to be something they weren't. I understood how to do that. It turned out the same principle applied to everything else, and I had just taken longer to apply it. I called Ben that evening. We had met at a design conference in September. He was an architect, quieter than he appeared at first, someone who asked questions and listened to the answers. We had been talking regularly since October, building something at a pace that felt genuinely unhurried. I told him about the penthouse. He said he'd like to see it sometime. I said I thought that could be arranged. I ate dinner by myself that night, at a table by the window in my South End apartment, with the winter dark outside and the lamp on and the room warm. I felt something I had not felt in a long time, not happiness exactly, not yet, but something adjacent to it. The particular quietness of a person who has finally stopped bracing. I have spent years being good at the wrong things, at keeping the peace, at not asking, at making everything look fine from the outside. There is a specific type of family dynamic that is easy to mistake for love because it contains many of love's surface features: attention, involvement, history, shared language, while being structured around something entirely different. What Victoria Harrison built in her family was not a relationship. It was an arrangement. One in which proximity and loyalty were extended in exchange for compliance, and withdrawn the moment compliance was withheld. Paige spent 32 years inside that arrangement before she understood its terms. What makes this story psychologically particular is not the fraud itself, dramatic as it was, but the scaffolding that made the fraud possible. Victoria didn't forge a signature and assume no one would notice. She spent years building a narrative infrastructure. Eleanor was declining, Paige was manipulative, the family's interests required unity. This narrative served two functions simultaneously. It discredited the most likely witnesses to the truth, Eleanor and Paige, and it created a social environment in which anyone who questioned the story would seem to be siding with instability against family cohesion. It was, in its way, a piece of expert construction. What's important to understand is that Paige's silence was not passive. It was a choice, repeatedly made, repeatedly rational, repeatedly wrong. Each time she stayed quiet, she was calculating that exposure would cost more than endurance. And for a long time, she was right. The calculation only broke down when the cost of endurance exceeded everything else, when the forgery came to light and the silence that had felt protective was revealed as something that had been serving her mother's architecture, not her own. The accumulation dynamic here is worth naming directly. No single event in this story is catastrophic in isolation. A will that causes tension. Lunch conversations about practicality. Phone calls from distant relatives. A wedding at which documents are presented. Each of these is containable. The devastation came from the sequence, from the way each event was designed to normalize the next one, to make the next task seem like a natural extension of everything that had already been conceded. By the time the envelope appeared at the wedding, Victoria had spent 3 years constructing a situation in which the room, the occasion, and the assembled social pressure were all supposed to do her work for her. She miscalculated one thing, that Eleanor was watching. Richard's role deserves separate attention because it is the quieter damage. He did not forge signatures. He did not run a slander campaign. He stood in a kitchen with his wine and said, "Your mother has a lot riding on this," and walked back to the dining room. Enablement of that particular texture, careful, deniable, expressed as resignation rather than complicity, is its own category of harm. It requires Paige to do the emotional work of deciding what it means, over and over, without ever receiving a clear answer. That ambiguity was its own erosion. What the story ultimately reveals is something uncomfortable about trust within families specifically, that we calibrate our threat detection differently for people we love. We extend interpretive charity we would not extend to strangers. We read pressure as concern, manipulation as involvement, control as care. Not because we're foolish, but because the alternative, that the people who were supposed to protect us were doing something else entirely, is a reordering of reality that the self resists for as long as it possibly can. Paige's final composure in that ballroom, picking up her earring, saying nothing, walking out, was not performance. It was the behavior of someone who had already done all the internal work before the public moment arrived. The confrontation was not where the hard thing happened. The hard thing happened in a garden in Newton, on a bench between two women who loved each other, when the truth was finally said out loud between them. What stays with me about this story, what I keep coming back to, is not the fraud, or the slap, or the courtroom aftermath. It's the garden. Eleanor sitting among her irises, looking at her hands. The silence before she said, "I didn't sell it." There is something about the moment when a person finally hears what they already knew that is different from the moment of discovery itself. It carries a different weight. How many times do we look at something directly and choose not to fully see it? Not out of stupidity, but out of love. Out of the particular hope that the people who should have been safe actually were. The answer Paige found, in the end, was not about justice or inheritance or winning. It was simpler and harder than any of that. It was the decision to stop organizing her reality around other people's comfort and start trusting what she could actually see. That's not a small thing. For some of us, it takes a lifetime to learn it.